issue of inflation, which is haunting capitalist economies around the world, especially the United States. And given how many of you have asked me to speak to that issue, I'm going to restrict myself to one opening, shorter discussion. And it is also about something many of you have asked me to speak to. This has to do with sanctions. Sanctions that are mostly an activity of the United States government, certainly led, often initiated, and usually pursued most aggressively by the United States, but sometimes with allies, as in the case of sanctions these days being imposed on Russia in relationship to the Ukraine. But I want to talk here about the sanctions in a general way, because your questions have quite rightly focused on that. And particularly, I'm going to be talking about sanctions against Russia, because those have been the major ones, literally, for the last 30 years. That's right. Within a very short time, after the Soviet Union imploded and was no longer there, various things that the Russian leaderships did irked the United States to the point of imposing economic sanctions of all kinds, blocking Russian companies or companies based in Russia from doing kinds of transaction, imposing burdens on companies outside of Russia that did business with those companies inside Russia, restrictions on banking, restrictions on moving money abroad, and so on. Started in the 1990s and continued right up to the present moment. These sanctions, therefore, have been going on, as I say, for over 30 years. And therefore, the first thing to understand about these sanctions is that Russia, in particular, but other countries as well, have learned over the years how to evade them, how to get around them, how to outwit them, and have learned it over and over again. This does not mean that sanctions have no effect. They surely do. But it also means that the effect they have is not likely to be anything near the political theater surrounding them. Let me give you a case in point. The little island of Cuba has been sanctioned economically by the United States for over half a century, nearly 60 years. The goal all that time was to cripple the Cuban economy, make it unviable, make the people so upset with the conditions they have to live on that they will blame the government, turn against it, and the United States would then be free of Fidel Castro or now his successors. That program of sanctions on a poor country with few defenses did not work. Fidel Castro lived out his life as Cuba's leader, and his successors remain firmly in power right now. It should give pause before you imagine that sanctions have anything like the effect that some have been claiming for them. Number two, sanctions in the case of Russia, and even sanctions in the case of countries like Iran and China, have a new reality to deal with that sanctions have never had to deal with before. Namely, that the United States, while clearly a superpower, particularly in military affairs, is no longer the economic superpower it once was. It is no longer the only major, big, powerful, rich economy that basically has been the situation since the end of the Second World War. again, over half a century old. The reason is there's now another huge, rich, powerful country that one can turn to if you get sanctioned by the United States, but you want an alternative place to borrow money, lend money, invest money, use a payment system, whatever your issue, the Chinese alternative is now there. And it is, of course, specifically and especially available to Russia because of the long-standing and most recently intensifying alliance between Russia on the one hand and China on the other. Of course, there are tensions in that alliance, as there always are in all alliances. We could recently see the kinds of tensions even in the countries applying sanctions. In the first day or two of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, the United States wanted to shut Russia off of the SWIFT international payment system. The Germans refused. After 2 or 3 days, the Germans changed their mind. Everyone in the world who pays attention to this wants to know what the United States gave to Germany to get such a reversal of policy that had been long the basic policy of Germany, not to get involved in European conflicts, not to get involved in military conflicts especially. So something very important had to be given to the new socialist government of Scholz in Germany, and when that becomes known, it'll be clearer why that particular tension in the alliance sanctioning got resolved. If I were the French or the Italians or the Spanish, I'd be particularly interested in what the United States gave Germany to get that done. Bottom line, the economics of sanctions suggest that mostly what they do is solidify mass support in other countries for their leaders, because those leaders can say that the burden of the sanction comes from abroad. They are not responsible. It is the foreigner trying to break them that is the problem. Iran didn't buckle to the sanctions imposed on it any more than the Cubans did, and I doubt the Russians are going to start now, given their history, either. Now for the main topic for today. This has to do with inflation. One of the many burdens that capitalist economic systems impose on the societies where they are the dominant economic system, like the United States, one of those burdens is inflation. Periodically, prices start going up. Not every price, but most of them. Not the same amount, but some, with some going very fast, others going slowly, but a general rise in prices. It is something most capitalist countries try to avoid, just like they try to avoid the business cycle, the periodic explosion of kind of the other side, unemployment, collapse. But these efforts to overcome, to prevent, to eradicate unemployment on the one hand and inflations on the other, the business cycles, many ups and downs, these efforts by capitalism have by and large failed. That's why we've had 3 economic downturns or crashes in this new century. The dot-com crash in 2000, subprime mortgage crash in 2008, and the COVID-19 crash over the last 2 years. And now we have, the other side of that sad story, and inflation. Okay, it's currently running between 7 and 8% per year here in the United States. That means, in general, on average, prices of the goods and services you and I buy are 7 to 8% more expensive this year than last year. That means, very simply, that if our income is the same this year as last year, we are 7 to 8% poorer, because the income, which hasn't changed, is confronting prices that have changed. They've gone up. So if the income is the same, there's fewer of those now more expensive goods and services that we can buy. Indeed, if your wages or your income went up by 7 or 8% from last year, and only a quite small minority of American workers can say that, but if it did, you're still not ahead. Yeah, you got 7 to 8% more money in your paycheck, but you have to pay 7 or 8% more for everything you buy. So you didn't get ahead at all. In other words, an inflation, whatever else it does, and we're going to be looking at what it does, is a mechanism that typically worsens the inequality a society already faces. And I'll get to why in a moment. Have inflations always been of this sort? No. Back in 1923, literally a century ago, we had a classic inflation in Germany. At that time, one of the most developed, advanced capitalist economies in the world. But they had a doozy of an inflation in which prices doubled at one point every couple of hours. So that's, of course, much worse of an inflation than the one we have now. And when you have that kind of inflation, it really does a number on the population, which is one of the reasons why many countries, and especially Germany, have been hysterically anxiety-ridden about inflation ever since. For the 50 years before that 1922 inflation in Germany, every German family had been exemplary in its frugality. It had saved money. It had put aside, even if it didn't earn much, it had put aside money, proud of its thrift. And then in a matter of days and weeks, as prices went up and up and up quickly, the value of those savings accumulated over half a century were wiped out. You'd been saving for 50 years, and the total that you had saved would now afford you 1/4 pound of butter. It was a trauma for the German people, the middle classes and the working classes that had saved so desperately, denied themselves all kinds of goods and services in order to save, were suddenly wiped out. The saves meaningless. In their fury, in their upset, in their desperation, it wasn't all that surprising that when they were then hit 5-6 years later by the Great Depression, 1929, it was too much. The inflation, and then a few years later the Depression, a 1-2 punch that made the German people give power to Adolf Hitler, who promised by some magic to get him out of this disaster, only it turned out he made it even worse. Inflations are very dangerous defects of capitalist systems. Okay, let's make another comparison, just so you understand. Is there inflation in China right now? In other words, is it unique to the United States, or is it everywhere? There is a rise of prices in China right now. The last month's statistics indicate that on an annual basis, prices are rising in China now at 0.9%. So let me be clear. Over the last year, as prices in the United States rose 8%, prices in China rose less than 1%. And I will come back and talk to you about the consequences of so enormous a difference. And in many other countries, you will find in general right now, most of them are midway between the Chinese and the American. Few are as well controlled as the Chinese, and a few are as out of control with their prices as the United States. Okay, if I've established, and if you already know from your own visits to the supermarket, to the stores where you buy goods and services, when you already know about the inflation and you've already probably figured out what it's doing to you, let me ask and answer some questions that you should have already known the answer to. But given the quality of economics education in the United States, and I'm part of the profession that teaches this subject, we have done a very poor job. So I need to explain it. And I think you need, all of you, to understand what is happening to all of us as we go through this inflation. Who determines the prices? In other words, who's in a position to raise the price? Now, most of you know that you're not. In other words, it's an interesting question. Who is raising the prices as we live in an inflation? And the answer is employers. The people who run the businesses of the United States, the CEOs in corporations, the owners, the top bosses of middle and small enterprises, the partners, if you're a law firm or whatever it is, it's the tiny minority of our people who determine prices. It is not the government. It is not the employees. For those of you that have been employees, that's most of you, you probably have noticed that among your job responsibilities, determining the prices of what you help to produce is not among them. You are not allowed to do that. You are excluded. So who sets the prices? Employers. And what percentage are employers of the American people? 1%, if that. In other words, an inflation is a set of decisions made by 1% of the people, the richest, the top owners, operators of our businesses, and it is a fact we have to live with for the other 99%. Don't please forget that reality. Next question. Why do employers raise prices? Perfectly reasonable question, which I'm going to answer, and the answer is as important as anything else I have to share with you today. Employers raise prices for the same reason that employers do pretty much everything else they do. In other words, the decision about setting prices is designed to make money. If you take a course at a business school, if you get your MBA degree from a business school, you will have sat through countless classes in which you have learned things that can be summarized with the phrase, profit is our bottom line, or profit is the goal, or charge as much as the market will bear, or profits is what it's all about. You don't have to take my word for it. That's what the people who make the decisions about prices tell you. They set prices to make money. And since in the capitalist system, you are rewarded with a fat salary, with a promotion, with the respect of those around you, if you're a businessman or woman, by how successful your profits are, how regularly and nicely they rise, you are going to be interested in raising your prices if and when it can improve your profits. So the honest answer to the question, why are the employers, that tiny minority, raising prices, thereby causing and running an inflation, the answer is because that's the most profitable strategy available to them right now, and they're doing it. But here then is immediately a problem. When you raise the price of anything, you are going to lead some people to decide not to buy whatever it is that you're raising the price of. You double the price of shoes, and they're going to be people who wear their old shoes a good bit longer. So every time a company raises its price, that is, that tiny minority decides to raise the price, they watch very carefully, hoping that only a small number of people decide not to buy. And they hope that the number who decide not to buy is much smaller than the extra revenue they're going to get because all those other people continue to buy and pay the higher price. And they're concerned enough that they go to work because they don't want their customers to get angry at them. Because try to understand with me, if you haven't already, that when the price of something you buy, a box of cereal for your breakfast, for example, when the price goes up, you're getting the same box of cereal you got last week, last month, last year, before the price went up, but you're now giving more of your money for that box. That means you get the same amount of cereal you used to get, but you give up more money. And from the point of view of the employer, who's clapping his or her hands, they're giving you the same box of cereal, but they're getting more money out of your pocket. In other words, an inflation moves wealth from the buyer to the seller. That's what it's for. And they know you might be angry about that. You might decide that you are being, here we go, ripped off. You might be even more angry if there was an honest explanation saying to you, we just raised the price of the shoes, of the blouse, of the hamburger, of the box of cereal, because we want to make more profits in this company. That might make you upset because you'd be confronted with that reality. It's bad for you to pay more, and it's good for them to get you to do it. So the capitalist class, when there's an inflation, becomes very loud about scapegoating somebody else. You see, that's helpful to them. They want us to believe that they didn't raise their prices to make more profits or to protect the profits they already were earning. No. They only did it because they were, get ready, get your handkerchief, forced to do it. And let me give you some examples. Here's the very popular one. We wouldn't have raised the price, we employers, but we had to. Really? Why? Well, the workers were getting or demanding more wages. So we had to raise our prices to cover the higher wages. And we wouldn't have done it if it hadn't been those awful working people who demanded more. This is almost always a lie. It would be a lie right now, and the way to explain that is very simple. Prices are rising in this country by 7 to 8%. Average wages are rising around 5.25%. So obviously, even if there is some grain of truth to the notion that you're paying higher wages, you're jacking up your prices well beyond all of that. So let's be honest. Moreover, workers have a hard time getting higher wages. They usually use the argument, our prices are going up, please give us more, but they have a clear problem. The employer may decide not to agree to that, and then what do? In the private sector of our country, less than 7% of workers are in unions, so they can't strike. The vast majority have no union. Those who do have a union have another problem. Most unions have a contract with the employer that covers wages for 2 to 3 years. You can't raise them in that period, so even if prices are going up, you have to wait for the contract to expire 1, 2, 3 years from now before you can even ask. And it's not at all clear that you will get. So blaming the workers, that's a cheap shot, cheap out, most of the time, very minimally relevant. Here's another one that's really popular these days. There have been disruptions in the supply chain. All right, let me translate that into English. Somehow, goods are not getting through, and so they're scarce, you see, And if we all want them, but they're scarcer than they used to be, those who have some of these scarce items to sell can and will jack up the price. But we shouldn't be angry at them, you see. They're just taking advantage of some disruption in the supply chain. Calling it a disruption in the supply chain is cute. It is a way of focusing people's attention on something else. We can be reminded that there was a big freighter stuck in the Suez Canal a few months ago, and we saw the funny pictures, and maybe that has something to do with it. Well, my answer is, let's not be naive. Every businessman and woman knows that if you can restrict the supply, that then becomes a way to force up the price. All the people who want whatever you're restricting the supply of will compete with one another, bidding up the price to get whatever is scarce. You can pretend that all the scarcity is a force of nature. It just happened. I don't know how it would happen. It's just a disrupted supply chain. But that naivete is really silly. We have a supply chain disruption because it's profitable for the sellers of goods to use scarcity to jack up their profits by raising their prices. And then there's the one I like the most. I call it the libertarian ploy. Libertarians are very, very, very useful to capitalism because they blame all of its problems on the government. This is wonderful. It allows a business to kick its workers, and the workers get angry, not at the business that kicks them, but at the government. It allows a bank to throw you out of your home because you haven't covered your mortgage, and you get angry at the politicians, not the bank that evicted you, not the corporation that fired you. It's remarkable. And true enough, the libertarians come through. And why do we have an inflation? They want us to believe. The answer, the government. And not just the government anywhere, but the government that runs the money system, the Federal Reserve, our central bank. And so they love to tell stories about how the central bank has been pumping money into the economy, which is true, and that money is now enabling prices to go up. That's true too, but it doesn't face a simple fact. The Federal Reserve has been pumping massive amounts of money into the American economy every year since the year 2000. That's 22 years. And we only have an inflation this last year. We didn't have it the other 19. So pumping money is clearly not the cause. Something else has to explain it. And I think I did. Here's the story, the basic story. Corporations see now the need, and in some cases, the desperate need to jack up their profits. Many companies, particularly small and medium ones, had a really rough time over the last 2 years. The crash of 2020, the pandemic of the last 2 years. We've never had a pandemic in public health and an economic crash at the same time. It was really hard, and many of these companies did not get the kinds of profits they anticipated, they hoped for, they expected, they had gotten used to. And now they think it's their chance to make up for the 2 years of profit they lost. And that's why they're raising prices to recoup their profits. Or to say the same thing in an honest English, they're ripping us all off as buyers to recoup what happened to them, as if the buying public, you and me, also didn't suffer the last 2 years. All kinds of economic, political, psychological, medical difficulties. We too want to make up what we lost. But they can use inflation to do it, and the irony is it makes life even harder for us. No wonder the country is ripped apart by conflict, disagreement, rage, anger, bitterness, violence. It's not all about Mr. Trump. It's not even significantly about that. It's about much deeper problems that this economy has, symbolized now very clearly, very sharply, by an inflation. The working class of America, the vast majority of people who are employees, they don't set prices, they have the prices set over them. Prices are dictated by a tiny minority. The dictatorship of that class of people, as administered to the American working class after 2 years of COVID and 2 years of stunning economic lack of activity, a very harsh slap in the face. That's what the inflation is. You're coming out of COVID, you're coming out of the crash. Well, here's a new burden for you. We're going to slap you with an inflation. A decent society, one that actually believed all that talk about we're in it all together, we're going to get through this all together. These are virtual quotes from President Biden and people like that. A decent society could not and would not dare to whack its population with an inflation after putting it through a failed preparation for this disease, a failed program to deal with it. I want to remind you, the United States has among the very worst records in coping with this virus in the whole world. To follow that up with an inflation, my goodness, you are asking for troubles beyond anything we have seen so far. Inflation is not some detail about the economy. It's a fundamental flaw. It has existed before we've had capitalism. But capitalism has not only not solved it, but made use of it in ways that in the long run threaten to be self-destructive for capitalism